Rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And
our speaker today is Mary Beth Graham, and this is her topic, the Lincoln's Guest at Ford's Theater. Mary Beth Graham was a part of a handful of interested people who joined Tom Cecil in 2003 in exploring his desire to have a statue of Lincoln at the courthouse in commemoration of Lincoln's speech there on September 17, 1859. Her interest in Lincoln has strengthened throughout the years, bringing innumerable books and memorabilia into her and Ben's home. Prior to Lincoln coming into her life, she was the administrator of the Iddings Foundation for over 36 years. And we're approaching the Iddings Foundation as master gardeners for a grant for the Grotto Project.
I'm not there anymore.
I know. She served on the West Carrollton School Board for nearly 20 years. She helped to save the Victory Theater from demolition and continues to believe in the possible renewal of the arcade. She is a life trustee of Ohio Wesleyan University, her alma mater, and also currently is a trustee of the Antioch Midwest University and Eastway. Within the Lincoln Society of Dayton, Mary Beth has been program chairman, editor of the Lincoln Log, developer of programs for the UD Lifelong Learning Series, and vice president of the organization. Please welcome Mary Beth Graham.
Thank you very much. It's nice to see all of you here today. And we started something, this is before we get to the program. It's the trivia. And I want you to think about these things. They're related to our month of November, which might make it a little easier. First of all, you know, in the middle of November is the celebration of the Gettysburg Address. So I would like someone at the end of the program to let me know how many people were there when Lincoln gave his Gettysburg Address. And the second question is the election of 1864, and of course we're just shy of our election day here. And on that election day, of the votes that were cast, what was the percentage of those in the presidential election that were for Lincoln? So you have to think about how many attended the Gettysburg Address and the percentage of votes that Lincoln accumulated during the election of 1864. So that's your trivia. You can let your mind wander on those things. I'm sorry, what?
Were we going to have 2 questions or 3?
That's 2 questions. Gettysburg Address, election. Okay? At least that's the way I count. Well, today's program really started a couple of years ago when our member Dave Gossett gave me a manila folder with some clippings. And they were copies of the clippings, and eventually I got around to looking at them, and it's like, well, this is kind of interesting. Here was a picture of this woman who was Clara Harris, and her picture hung at Ford's Theater, and it hung in the National Archives. And what's wrong? That's not Clara Harris. So this was kind of a mystery that was being solved, and it was quite intriguing, and I really didn't know much about Clara Harris and Major Rathbone, and so I started kind of focusing on some books and articles and the web and things like that. But what I don't remember is how Dave came by those clippings. So I'm going to let him come up and fill that part in to help my memory, and then we'll move on with the program.
I have been a collector of medals, metallic medals, and I've been interested in Lincoln material for a lot of years. And in connection with my collecting activities, I'm a member of the Token and Medal Society of the United States, which is involved in collecting and basically literature to publicize different aspects of the hobby and different subject matters and so forth. So I get this publication. It's called the TAMS Journal. It comes every other month, 6 times a year. And one time I was looking through this, and on the last page, there's an advertisement from a gentleman who is interested in purchasing Lincoln medals. And to use his words, he said, very high dollar amounts paid for. And then he tells you a little bit about what he wants. Well, that very high dollar amount really attracted me. So I have one that looks, I believe it's a copy of this one right here. And by the way, there are some of these up here for display if you'd like to look at them at any point. So I responded. This gentleman's name is William Hallam, Hallam Weber, W-E-B-B-E-R with 2 B's. He lives in Rockville, Maryland, which is one of the northern suburbs of the Washington area, as most of you know. And I've always pictured it as being kind of an upscale neighborhood. And anyway, so I think I called this guy. Yeah, he had a phone number here. So I called him, and I told him what I had, and he starts relating some of his information to me as to what's out there, you know. And this conversation goes on, and I'm thinking, you know, how can I get away from this guy? Anyway, it turns out that the piece I had was not one for which he was willing to pay very high dollar amounts. So anyway, I think it took me a good 20 minutes or so, and I finally found a polite ending to the conversation. And but he was going on about this subject matter that Mary Beth was going to talk about, and different things. One thing I wanted to mention, these ads are pretty expensive. For instance, I think the full page ad like he's got here is $1,260 a year. And I know he has run this in every issue for at least 2 years. So that's quite an advertising budget. But anyway, I read through this information, and I have so many collectibles now, I decided I really didn't want to keep it. And I asked Mary Beth if she would like to have it, and here we are today. So.
Well, thank you. I didn't remember the story of you connecting and talking with this man, because one of the other things was a copy of the letter that Mr. Weber had in his correspondence with the National Archives, trying to prove, was this Clara Harris or not?
Right.
So, okay.
You're welcome. From my perusal of the information, it looked like he's done a lot of research.
Oh, I think so.
Yeah.
Yes. Very thorough.
Thank you.
Very thorough. He had started looking into the picture of Clara Harris because he was interested in buying a collection of photographs, and I think that was going to be auctioned, and it was very special. These were portraits of people who had been involved with Lincoln, either at the assassination at the theater or at the Peterson House during his last hours. And he wanted to confirm that all of those people, the photographs, were valid before he, of course, put in a bid on the lot. And that's when he began to question about Miss Harris. So we'll get started. And I do want to say on the side table, feel free to see them afterwards. I have borrowed the 2 they're not photographs, they're lithographs that are in frames from Gary Kersey, who has a marvelous collection of Lincoln and will be in his place in Wilmington in June as our little trip out. And that's just a sample of what he has, but these are the authentic lithographs, and later on we'll have them because they were in books, and so I copied them in part of the PowerPoint. The newspapers that are there are not authentic, or they wouldn't be out there for you to touch. They're copies from the 1890s, so there still is age on them, but they give you some idea of the newspapers after Lincoln was assassinated and what was being talked about at that time as well. Good Friday, April 14th, 1865, dawned with some sunshine, and Lincoln had a cabinet meeting in the morning. He met with some individuals during the day, and in the afternoon, about 3 o'clock, he said, "Mary, let's go for a drive." So they got their carriage ready and sat in the back, and Mary later said that Lincoln was in such a good frame of mind. I said, "You almost scare me. You are so much fun today, and you're so happy." And he said, "Yes, I am happy because today I consider the war is over." So they had a lovely time. They talked about their future, what was going to happen after the end of his second term. And they thought in all probability they'd return to Springfield, and Lincoln would again become a lawyer there in the town that they all loved so very much. Well, Mary reminded Lincoln that they were going to the play that night to Ford's Theater, and it had been announced in the paper that the Lincolns were going to come as well as the Grants. And the one thing that meant was the ticket prices started edging up, and the ticket scalpers were busy at work. So instead of $25, $75, or $1 for a seat at the theater that night, they began to charge $2.50. And enough people bought, they had a sellout crowd. Almost 1,700 people were at the theater. As I mentioned, the Grants were expected to come. And of course, here are the Lincolns. They need no introduction. And I think that one place described the dress that she wore to the theater as being white with black stripes, so that could very well be what she had on that night. And the Grants, unfortunately, Mrs. Grant was not charmed by Mary Lincoln, and she felt that it was more important for the two of them to go to New Jersey, where they would celebrate the end of the war with their two sons. So they bowed out of going to the theater, and a number of people were invited who also had excuses, including their son Robert, who had just come back for the Easter weekend from college, and he said, "You know, I'm really tired," or from the war. He was in the service at that time. He said, I'm really tired. I'm going to go to bed early tonight. Thanks, I'll skip the theater." And then someone else occurred to them. Now, Ira Harris, at that point was a senator from New York. He had replaced Seward when Seward became part of Lincoln's cabinet as the senator, and had brought his family to town. Interestingly enough, he had 4 children, one of whom was Clara Harris. And at the time that Clara was 13, her mother died. And several years later, he married Mrs. Rathbone, whose husband, having been mayor of Albany, that both families were from Albany, New York. And so he married Mrs. Rathbone, and the merged family now had 2 Rathbone sons, Henry and Jared, plus the 4 Harris children. He was a good friend of the Lincolns, and in fact, he was so often a frequent visitor in the evenings with President Lincoln that Lincoln often joked about, "I need to check under my bed at night to make sure you're not hiding there looking for more patronage." So they were good friends, and Mrs. Lincoln really looked on his daughter as his daughter as almost a daughter for her. They were very, very close and often attended the theater, just the 2 of them. It was a tough election, but on about the 9th ballot, Ira Harris was chosen to be the senator that particular year. So he moved the family into a very large house just off of Lafayette Square, and their friendship with the Lincolns began. Here is a picture of Major Henry Rathbone, one of the Rathbone sons. And when the parents were married, he was about 10, I think, and Clara was about 13. He was 3 years her junior. So they literally grew up together, and then they fell in love, and they had gotten engaged just before the Civil War started. And once the war began, he joined forces and rose to the rank of major. He decided this was not a good time to get married, so that was put on hold then. He saw action in the Battle of Antietam and Fredericksburg, and was never really a very strong, healthy individual. And so his stepfather, Ira Harris, was able to use his influence and suggested that perhaps the desk job in 1865 would be better suited for Major Rathbone. So he was also based there in Washington, D.C. Now this is Clara, and this is an enlargement of the wrong Clara Harris. Thank you to Mr. Weber. So at this point, we have no idea who this poor lady is, but she got her big picture in Ford's Theater, and also as part of the National Archives for 30 or more years, until they discovered that this was in fact an error. She was very cultured, she was self-assured, she moved in high social circles in Washington, and was an intimate friend of Mary Lincoln. And as I mentioned, Mary thought of her as close to a daughter as she could possibly have. She was dark-haired, and they mentioned she often had little spit curls around her forehead. But she was regarded as a very attractive and very social individual. Now, the night that they went with the Lincolns to the play, Major Rathbone did not go in his uniform. And you'll want to keep that in mind when you see some of the portrayals of that event later on in the slides. He was there in a suit. He had no weapon with him. He was going to be social and just enjoy the evening. Clara, in fact, wore a lovely white dress. And there she is with some spit curls on her forehead as well.
That's really Clara? That's the real Clara?
As far as we know now, that is the real Clara. Till someone else comes along with a different idea. She was 30 years old the evening that they went to the Ford's Theater, and as I say, she was engaged to Rathbone, although they had put aside their plans to get married. It was interrupted by the war. She was one of 4 children, and the white dress played an important part as the evening wore on. When the Lincoln stopped for them, and it was, as you know, a last-minute acceptance that they would go to the theater, but Major Rathbone and Clara were terribly excited. They thought, what an honor to be invited by the Lincolns into a public place such as Ford's Theater. So they were flushed with excitement, and they had a cheery ride. Clara later said that she had never seen Lincoln in such a good frame of mind, and it was a very short carriage ride, perhaps 10 minutes from their home to the theater. Lincoln had a Brooks Brother overcoat with him that night because it was a little misty, a little chilly, and so he was wearing that. But it was the gayest of spirits for the 4 of them as they proceeded. And of course, this is a period piece of Ford's Theater, the large building in the center. And looking at it from the other end of the block, looking up, is another picture of the theater. One of the saloons that played a role during the evening of the assassination, both for Booth and for the guard at the Lincoln's door, would be in line with the theater as well. When they arrived, the play had already started, And when they walked into the theater, they found that what was called the state box, the president's box that evening, was well decorated with a banner of the Treasury, as well as the United States flags. Large engraving of George Washington was the picture there in the middle. It was very festive appearing. And this, you can see there's also seating below them. And this is even better to show you the boxes are actually part of the stage. All right, but the box where the Lincolns were sitting and the white area below actually is on the stage. And then the balconies, the dress circles, came very close to them at that point. And this is a floor plan that shows the dress circles. And down on the far right would be the small boxes. They had combined box 8 and box 7 that night into one so that no one would be sitting close to the Lincolns that evening. And this would be the orchestra, which is the main floor leading up to the stage. And of course, the stage would be at this end of that print. With this illustration, this is a drawing that really came from Major Rathbone, and he used it to explain the arrangement of everyone in the box and at the time of Booth's coming into the box. So if you go down to the right-hand corner, there is a door that has H, and I'm sorry, I don't know how to make the pointer work, but it's right behind the last row of seats. And so that was the door they used to enter into a vestibule area, and then F is open, is the open door, and they did not open the door that's marked G. That was another door into this area. Of the two chairs, Lincoln sat in a red rocker closest to the audience, and what you see is the orchestra. This is the dress going this way, the dress circles. The orchestra is the vertical lines at the top with the L, and M is the actual stage. So you can see they really are sitting immediately above the stage. There was a sofa in the back, very small, and Major Rathbone sat on the edge of the sofa. Clara sat in the chair closest to him, and there was a spare chair that was not being used. But that was the arrangement of the box for the evening. As they came into the theater, you can imagine people were so excited because they really thought they were going to see Lincoln and the Grants. There was some disappointment that the Grants had not come, but Lincoln walked in holding Mary's hand first, followed by Major Rathbone and Clara, and everyone began to clap and shout, and the house lights went up, and the orchestra broke into Hail to the Chief, and the actors on the stage froze in their lines and cheered along with everyone else. So it was a very warm reception, and Lincoln bowed, placed his hand over his heart, as we've seen artists do often here in town, and in appreciation, and gave, as someone said later, some of the warmest, broadest smiles I've ever seen. So he was in a very, very happy mood. And they went to see Our American Cousin, which is not new, I don't think, to any of us. It starred Laura Keene. She played a role later on in the evening. And part of it's a poster that was used, and then the playbill that was handed to them as they came into the theater. It's an English play, and it's full of just really awful, dry lines. I mean, you think, how could anybody ever laugh at those things now? But it seemed to appeal to the audiences in those days, at least. Maybe we have a different sense of humor today, I don't know. But in any case, the members of the state box soon got into the play, even though they were 20 minutes late. It wasn't hard to pick up on the plot. And they were enjoying themselves. And 3 people could be seen. Lincoln, in fact, was seated behind one of the flags so that not many people in the audience could actually see where he was seated once he sat in his rocker. And there's the rocker. It's now in Greenfield Village in the museum up there, but it was red, and Lincoln made himself very comfortable in it. They'd moved it in especially for his use that night, and he did appreciate that a great deal. So within the box during the play, they joined in the laughter, and Lincoln began to relax, and Rathbone reached out to Clara to hold her hand, and Lincoln reached over to take Mary's hand. Now, he's not one for public affection shows, and even though that was still private, Mary whispered to Lincoln, "What will Miss Harris think of my hanging on to you so?" And Lincoln smiled with affection, and he replied, "Oh, she won't. She'll think nothing of it." And those were the last words that Lincoln ever uttered. So he continued to hold her hand, and Act 3, Scene 2 started. Lincoln felt a draft, and so he got up and went for his coat, which he'd put aside earlier in the evening, and draped it around his shoulders. And at that point, he began to, now he's sitting close to the railing, and so he puts his left arm out on the railing and just sort of tilts his head just a little bit like this, maybe to see better or to hear better what's going on. And all 4 of them really were enjoying in the humor at that time. Now, in the meantime, unknown to them, of course, Booth had easily entered the theater because he was known there. He was a famous actor, and he was very handsome. And the ticket taker, of course, just said, "Oh, you know, of course, go on." So he went up the stairs to the area where he was going to do his deed. And this is just one of the many pictures, but he was handsome. He had women swooning all over it, and so he was an early matinee idol, I guess one would say. When he got up outside the area, of course, he'd cased the joint earlier, so to speak, he realized that the guard who was assigned to sit outside Lincoln's door, and with whom he thought he would have to either tussle or get rid of it in some way, was gone. He'd been bored. So the guard decided he'd just walk off, get a drink, enjoy himself, come back later, no big deal. So if you remember that illustration, he opens the door at the end and walks in, and according to Major Rathbone, the one door was not closed. Now, in some cases, they say he opened a door, he looked through a peephole. I don't know what the right version is. But nevertheless, as he came in the first door, he realized that somebody might follow him, and he couldn't latch it or lock it. So he had gotten a part of a music stand and had gouged out the plaster from the wall and was able to brace that against the door so that no one from the outside could open the door at that point. So right now he's, quote, trapped in the boxes. He quietly opened the door, walked up to the box, and he could see the back of the rocker, and of course with Lincoln seated inside. He had a single-shot Derringer in his right hand, and in his left hand he held what's been described as a Bowie knife, a hunting knife, but it was a dagger of sorts. And when there was a particular line he was waiting for, because he knew that's when the audience would literally explode in laughter, and it would muffle any shot or any hearing of the shot that he was prepared to do. And the line was, "Wow, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, you I've never seen this word.
Psychologize an old man trap.
Thank you. Good. I appreciate that, Bob, because I've puzzled on how to how to pronounce that word. Say it one more time. Say it one more time.
Sockdologize an old man.
Okay. All right. Well, he was alone on the stage, and the whole audience laughed. So, and thought that was so funny. And at that point, he pulls the trigger and shoots Lincoln behind his left ear. The women don't respond. They don't hear anything. They're not aware of anything happening. Rathbone immediately, he's heard the shot, he turns and he sees the smoke from the gun, and he rises to encounter whoever this intruder happens to be. And the only thing that Lincoln did was that his head dropped to his chest, and of course the rocker stopped rocking. Booth tried to force his way between the president and Mary Lincoln. Remember, they were seated side by side and fairly close to each other. And Rathbone approached him, and Booth raised his dagger, aiming for the heart of this person who was interfering with him. And in parrying the blow, Rathbone was slashed between his left elbow and his shoulder quite severely. He sort of staggered back, caught his breath, and in the meantime, Booth is approaching the ledge to jump off, and Rathbone makes another valiant attempt to stop him. He grabs his coat, and probably that threw him off as far as jumping smoothly, as he had intended to do, and so he caught his spur in the one of the buntings that was there. He also was able to slash towards Rathbone's head, but that became a rather minor wound as well. And in the process, he lost a spur. And some of you may remember that, well, I'm not even sure how many years ago, but quite a few years ago, when we were doing the Lincoln programs, we became aware of a woman who lived here in Dayton, and she was nearing 100 at the time. And Sam Black had come into contact with her, our nice young friend Sam. And she told the story that her father had been on duty as either one of the policemen who came in and answered, or perhaps one of the military people. At this point, I'm vague. But anyway, he found the spur, and he thought it would be evidence, because at that point they didn't know who they were looking for as the assassin. And so he turned it in to the officials at that time. But it was quite an intriguing story to think that someone in Dayton had a really personal connection like that. Well, Booth, as you know, fell to the stage. There he is, partially down. Probably the audience hadn't really started to respond yet, because some of them think, oh, this is, for some reason, this is part of the play. You know, we don't know exactly what's happening, but they didn't think that it was anything really serious out of the ordinary. And then, of course, he broke his shin, left shin above, well, I can go back. Right above the ankle, and then hobbled off the stage. And at that point, Rathbone is shouting, "Stop that man, stop that man." People still haven't reacted too fast. And Clara is shouting, you know, they've shot the president. It just becomes chaotic. It's so full of confusion. Rathbone is able to go to the door and discovers that it's, yes.
You left out one important thing.
Oh, I'm sorry.
When Booth got on the stage, he yelled out 6 separate
Tyrannus. Yes. Thank you.
Tyrants.
Yes. All right. You should be up here telling the story, Bob. I'd love to have you do that. But thank you. Yes, I did leave out that. In some cases, when people were giving their memories that night, they heard him yell, "The South is avenged." Some of them remember the 6 Semper Tyrannis. When he was in the booth with Lincoln and Rathbone and Clara Harris, Rathbone feels that he shouted freedom. So anyway, he was trying to make a very dramatic exit, Mr. Booth was, and that even emphasized it was part of the play. Here's somebody speaking from the stage. Of course, it has to be, and he is an actor. Well, in any case, they came to the slow realization that there was big trouble and a disaster had occurred. And Mary, of course, is shrieking and becoming hysterical once she realizes that that Lincoln is not responding to her touches and all. And Clara leans over the edge of the box and yells for water, and some people get up and start on the stage, and you can imagine everything really, no one knew exactly what to do. So some people left, and then they came to clear the theater as well. But the first doctor who did respond was a young man, Dr. Leal, who was 23 years old and had just recently gotten his medical diploma. But he did respond to work with Lincoln and stayed with him all the way through to the end. And other doctors deferred to him as well when they came to help out. In the meantime, Clara realizes that Rathbone has been quite wounded and bleeding profusely, and so she tries to comfort him, staunch the blood, so her hands, her face, her dress become very bloodied as well. And during the evening, Mary Lincoln is convinced that that's Lincoln's blood and not Colonel Rathbone or Major Rathbone's, and so that led to her being upset continually. Now, when the doctor arrived and looked at Lincoln, he thought that perhaps he'd been stabbed because he could see the wound that was suffered by Rathbone. And so he had Lincoln laid on the floor in the booth, in the box, so that he could examine him, and he couldn't find any wounds, any stab wounds, and was very puzzled. And then as he felt his head, he realized that behind, on his left side, there was a blood clot, and he removed that to relieve some of the pressure on the brain, and that obvious at that point that it was a gunshot wound. And he also realized that it was a mortal wound. There was no way that Lincoln could possibly survive. So Clara's dress is deeply stained, and you'll hear a little bit more about that quite soon. Clara moves Mary Lincoln over to the sofa that you saw earlier in the drawing and tries to comfort her and get her calm, and Clara realizes she can't really do anything more for the Major, and everyone's eyes are, of course, on Lincoln and doing something for him instead. Dr. Leal realizes also that Lincoln is wounded too badly to be moved to the White House. And so he says, we're going to take him across the street to one of the houses. Now, at that point, they didn't know it was going to be the Peterson house. They were going straight across the street, and no one was home at that house. And the next door was the Peterson house. And one of the boarders at that house came out with a lantern and said, oh, come in here, come in here. And so they did that. But before they moved Lincoln, when Clara asks for water and it is provided, Laura Keene, the actress who has the lead in the play, comes up and brings the water and tries to comfort Mary and talks with Clara. And then she says to the doctor, may I hold Lincoln's head? And so she sits on the floor in the box and places Lincoln's head in her lap, and of course now her dress becomes bloody as well, and she kept that as a memento of that awful night. They have prepared Lincoln to be carried across the street, and soldiers had to work to clear the way because outside everyone was hovering outside the theater, and it was difficult to get across. Now, this is probably, I don't know if you can figure it out or not. The stage, of course, is up at the top, and it's a cutaway from the theater, and then immediately in front where they've come out, and then at the very bottom is the small passageway as they've brought Lincoln into the Peterson house. This is from a publication that I picked up when I was at Ford's Theater. And so I called Ford's Theater and I said, I would like 50 copies so that I can give these out to the people who are here. It's excellent. And we did that much of it for you. I talked to the National Park Service, I talked to the people, I don't know how many different people at Ford's Theater. First, they couldn't understand what I was talking about, which was, I don't know, it seemed pretty obvious. There it is. What more do you want? But anyway, in the, what it worked out was they have none, they're out of print, they don't expect to reprint them. And I said, that's too bad, because your big anniversary is coming up in the spring and people are going to be wanting something like that. So I don't know if they're going to do something different or not. I'm sorry, I don't have copies for all of you. But there is one that's going to be in the raffle. That one. Yes, that one. So anyway, I tried. I really, really tried. Well, they've been able to carry Lincoln across, and there's the Peterson house as it looked at that time. It's red brick, and I hope you can see this because it gives the floor plan of the first floor. And it's a very narrow building. Some of you I know have been there. The stairs go up, which narrows the hall even more. And these people are trying to maneuver Lincoln's body down this very, very narrow hall. The front parlor becomes the place where Mary Lincoln spends most of the night on the death watch. The middle room is where Stanton, when he arrives to take charge, that becomes his office. And this very small drawing at the very top, 9 feet by 17 feet, keep those dimensions in mind, is the bed where there was a bed and about 3 chairs, and that was the bed where they put Lincoln. Now, none of the original furniture is there. They've gotten some furniture that simulates the way it looked that night. But the bed was too short. One of the doctors said, well, take the feet off, you know, the foot of the bed off, and they weren't able to do that. And so Lincoln was placed diagonally because of his tall frame. It was the only way they could do that. And in the meantime, while they're getting Lincoln settled, coming behind them are Mary Lincoln, Clara, and Major Rathbone. They're helping her across the street, and she's near hysterics. It's very difficult to get her to walk that far even. But they try to comfort her, and she would periodically go in and visit with Lincoln. And at one point, Stanton said, take that woman out of here, because she was just so beside herself. This is the bed, and to the best of my knowledge, this is a photograph that was taken the next day after Lincoln had died and had gone, or perhaps the day after. Matthew Brady came and took lots and lots of pictures of Peterson House as well as Ford's Theater. So it's not a very large bed, and you get a sense of the size of the room. Now, this is the way it looks today. This is the reconstruction, although the room is still no larger than the 9 feet by 17 feet, and this is beyond the bed at the other end of the room.
I think that's the original bed, it's still there.
The original bed supposedly is in Chicago in a museum, and so it's a replacement bed. Yeah, everything kind of got scattered. But they knew enough what it should look like that they got something that was very, very similar to that. In the meantime, before all these people started to arrive to be with Lincoln, Major Rathbone, going back to him, he's had no help. He's asked the doctors for some help, and finally one of them looked at him and decided that perhaps it was more serious than originally expected. And so Major Rathbone by now has lost a great deal of blood, ends up fainting there at Peterson House, and when he comes to, he is taken to their own house, back to Ira Harris's house, and is attended with the doctor there eventually. So Mrs. Lincoln and Clara and Rathbone sit in the parlor for a while before he faints, and then Laura Keene comes over and sort of takes the place, the actress, and she helps to comfort Mrs. Lincoln as much as possible. And even though Rathbone had been taken home, Clara stays with Mrs. Lincoln into the night longer. It's really, I don't know when she left. I thought she'd stayed all night, but the doctor who attended Rathbone indicated that when he was there working on stitching up the wound, that in fact Clara was there. She was very calm. She helped bring water and bandages and whatever he was asking for her to do. So different people have different stories. His son arrives, of course. Bob arrives, Robert Lincoln, and Mary tries to sit quietly, but it's very difficult for her. She goes in periodically to see Lincoln. And then the cabinet arrives and friends arrive, and these are various renditions in the 9x17 room of people who came to visit Lincoln. And in this picture, the woman in the back is supposed to be Clara Harris, and then of course Mary Lincoln, and Tad's in front, and he never was there, and then Robert Lincoln in uniform. By the end of the night, 2 of the soldiers decided they would make a list of how many had come, and they could remember, I think, maybe 38 who had come and gone, and someone else kept count and said, well, actually there were 46. So I think they got pretty close to that many in that picture. Everyone wanted to sort of have credit for being there when Lincoln drew his last breath. That was at 7:22 in the morning, the following morning. Oh, one more, oh, sorry. Oh, there is? Oh, yes. Oh, there's the biggie. Yeah. I think Ben did take time to count, and he got 44, did you? Something like that, yeah. So you may see a face you recognize as belonging to someone. But to get back to the story of Major Rathbone and Clara Harris, because their agony did not stop with that night or the next day. He healed, his physical wounds healed. They waited for 2 more years before they got married in July of 1867, and seemed to be happily married. They acquired a 22-room home on Lafayette Square. They were quite well-to-do. He left the Army in 1870. They had 3 children, and the first one happened to be born on Lincoln's birthday in 1870. They had another son the following year, and then a daughter. I've learned about the oldest son, but the other 2 people I couldn't find anything about, so I'm not sure exactly what happened to them. But Major Rathbone always was troubled. He never quite got over the assassination, the fact that he didn't stop Booth, that he couldn't have prevented the shot, that he felt very guilty himself, and that would prey on him a great deal on what could he do. So he never really forgave himself. In the meantime, Clara has kept her blood-stained dress, the white dress, with his blood on it. And she hung it in a closet in a summer home they had outside of Albany. When the year would go around at the anniversary of the assassination, the press would always approach Major Rathbone, Clara, now Mrs. Rathbone, and ask for their memories. What do they remember about that night? And it would all just stir it all up again, which was distressing really to both of them. And in those very early years, Clara said, "I saw Lincoln's ghost last night." And so she had some problems also, really putting it far enough behind her. And she decided that the only solution was not to destroy the dress, but to brick the closet. So the dress was hanging in the closet, and she simply had the wall bricked so no one could access it. It wasn't until 1910 that their oldest son decided it was time to get rid of the dress. It had not been good luck for the family, so he tore down the wall and burned her white dress. He had a series of jobs. He really couldn't keep anything very long. They would travel to Europe. I don't know how happy a childhood the 3 children had, but he finally was appointed by President Chester Arthur to the U.S. consulate in Hanover, Germany. And so the 3 children and Clara said, "I would like my sister Louise to come with me," because she was a little nervous about being with Henry and not really knowing how stable he was. In fact, he accused her of having affairs, of wanting to leave, of taking the children. All of those things preyed on his mind as well. And probably, except for the social stigma that in those days would have been terrible, she might have considered leaving Major Rathbone. She really was quite nervous about him. So he was appointed, and off they go. This was in 1882, and things seemed to go somewhat well, but it became obvious that he was losing his mental facilities, that he was growing more and more agitated, disturbed, erratic, violent, certainly not able to hold the job he'd been appointed to. And he finally, when he was convinced that she was going to take the children, tried to harm them on the 23rd of December of 1883. They'd been in Germany for a little more than a year. So Clara intervened and said to him, well, let's go back in the bedroom. It was in the evening and time for everyone to be in bed. And so their children were now 13 and 12 and 10, but he was able to be persuaded to go back to his own bedroom with Clara. And when they were there, he shot her, did not kill her, took out a knife, and stabbed her to death. He then took the knife on himself with 5 or 6 self-inflicted wounds, but he survived. It was an eerie replay of the assassination of April 14th, 1865. He actually blamed an intruder when the German police arrived the next day and said, well, it was all self-defense. And they did not believe him. They were going to try him for murder. And then they became aware of the fact he'd been so involved with the assassination of Lincoln and realized he was very mentally disturbed. So they instead committed him to an insane asylum there in Germany. And from 1883 until he died in 1911, when he was 74 years old, he lived in this insane asylum. Now, Clara was buried in Germany, and when he died, he was buried next to her in Germany. And after about, it was in 1952, and the German government realized no one had paid any attention to those graves, no one had ever visited, no one ever put flowers out, there weren't the headstones that a lot of other people had on their graves, that the best thing to do was they were abandoned graves. And so the 2 bodies were exhumed and disposed of, and no one knows what happened to their bones. So it was really a lot of sadness in their lives. This is their oldest son, whose name was also Henry, although he had a different middle name. And he went on to become a lawyer and a congressman from Chicago, from Illinois, and served in the Congress. And he, interestingly enough, also gave lectures about the assassination and his parents being present there. And what he did probably that has been the most valuable for all of us is that he introduced a bill that the United States government would purchase a Lincoln collection that belonged to Osborne Oldrod, or Royd, perhaps. I'm sorry I didn't have the picture. This is Rathbone, and this is Oldrod, who was quite elderly at the time. And after the assassination, Mr. Oldrod began to collect Lincoln items. And at that point, he had accumulated over 2,000 Lincoln items. And actually, he and his wife had lived in Springfield, Illinois, in Lincoln's house for several years, and then they asked him to leave. So he moved to Washington, D.C., where he set up his wares for display in the Peterson House. And there he charged admission, 10 cents a head, to come to see all of his things that he had accumulated during his lifetime about Lincoln. And he had so many people come, he literally was able to survive the rest of his life on those admission that he was charging. I think it was 10 cents to come in and take a look in those days. So anyway, Major Rathbone was, not Major, but his son Henry, I apologize, introduced this bill to get the collection, and the government did finally acquire that collection, and it became the basis for what is now in the Ford's Theater Museum, although the Ford's Theater Museum didn't begin until the 1930s, and then it started. Of course, the theater closed, and then it opened again, and now the museum is really quite exciting to go to. But I think yes, that was the final shot. The story of Clara and the Major is really so sad, and rather something that a lot of people don't know about, so I hope it was new to a few of you. I know Bob, and Diane's nodding her head in agreement, and a few others know the story, but now all of you know a little bit more about the Lincoln's guests that night when they went to Ford's Theater. And I will say, I didn't take time to read it, but if you have a chance to come across this book, We Saw Lincoln Shot, in it is the deposition from Major Rathbone that he made on the 17th of April. It's several pages long, that's why I didn't read it, but it's fascinating, and it has been called the most accurate report of what really happened and who was where was that night at the theater. So, thank you very much. I appreciate you listening.